Katia ke tuia tarangi e tū nei, tuia te papa e takoto nei, tuia hoki rātou ko wehe atu ki te pō uriuri, ki te pō tangotango, ki te pō i o te atu. Ka tukuna atu rātou kia moe, ka hoki mai ngā rārangi kōrero, me kia kera kia tātou te whatu urupā o rātou mā, no reira Māori ora kia tātou, Māori ora ki te kaupapa. Tēnei rā te tiki atu i te rārangi kōrero e ki ana tini whetū ki te rangi ko ngā uri o rangi tāne ki te whenua. Tēnei te uri o rangi te paia, te mihi kau atu ki a koutou katoa, kua tai mai ki te whakarongo ki tō tātou rangatira, ki te whakahoki kōrero, whakahoki mahara nōra ki tērā o ngā kaupapa ko Kaupapa Māori tēnā. Nō reira, kei Toi Ihorei o te kununga ki Pūrehuroa, e taku rangatira i ngā ngaroa koutou ko tō whānau, koutou ko tātua e ne Cheryl, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou e huitahi nei ki runga i te marae o hine i tēnei wā. Nō reira, kia koutou kua taia tinana mai, haere mai, kia koutou e hono mai i tapiti, koutou e hono mai ana i runga i te ipurangi tēnā ki rā koutou. Haere mai ki te whakarongo ki ngā kōrero kei tō tātou nei rangatira. Haere mai i runga i te ngākau hihiri mō te rangi a pōpō, ke whai wāhi ai a kaupapa Māori ki roto i o tātou kainga, ki roto i o tātou whare, ki runga i o tātou marae, puta noi te motu, puta noi te ao. Ka te ake te wahanga ki tēnei, me kia kira e whakatuwhira i te whare kōrero i tēnei rā whakahirahira. Ka tiki nātu he karakia mō tāne, nā te mea ko tātou rai ene e hui tahi ana pātata ki te marae o hine. Nō reira, whakarongora e tāne, ki te ahurewa, ki te pūkenga, ki te wānanga, ki te taura, ki te tauira. I pūia te take i wenuku, i au werangi. Tēnei ka hoho ki runga ki te tupua, ka hoho ki runga ki te tapito, ka hoho ki runga ki te kāhui o ngāriki, kia puterai nei tauira ki te whai au, ki te ao marama, whano, hara mai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Ai tēnei wā, ka tukunātu te rākau ki a koe kei te ahorangi, kei te hoa e moha. Ki te whakamara mātu i ngā kōrero kei tō tātou rangatira, nō reira e te ahorangi tēnā koe, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou katoa. I want to thank Professor Mehana Jury for joining us and for opening with this beautiful karakia. It is our pleasure at the Centre for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation or CARE to have with us today Professor Graham Hingangaroa Smith. At CARE, we have been conversing over the last 2 years or so about the question of activism in academia and what does activism look like in transforming academia. Particularly, we have been with our Activist in Residence program engaging with the question of the incorporation of culture into the neoliberal instruments of the university so that culture has lost its radical potential for transformation. It is within that context that the conversations and dialogues we have had with you, Professor Smith, have been some of the most enlightening and nurturing. For our global audience, because I'm sure our local audience here does not need an introduction to Professor Smith, but I am going to introduce him for our global audience. Distinguished Professor Graham Smith is a prominent Maori educationalist and advocate who has been at the forefront of alternative Maori initiatives in the education field and beyond. Professor Smith has been an influential contributor to the development of what he has described in his writings as the 25-year Maori educational revolution between 1982 and 2007. This period saw the development of a range of alternative educational strategies by Maori communities, beginning with Te Kohanga Reo, through the Maori Immersion Elementary School development, Maori secondary schools, and the emerging tertiary option of Ananga. He has had a hands-on approach with respect to his participation and commitment with these initiatives. In fact, often when we chat, you say that the power of your theorizing is evident in the calluses on your hands, and that is such an important invitation for us in academia to really think about the work of activism and what academic work looks like. Professor Smith was the foundation chairperson of the Council for Te Whare Whananga o Awanuirangi, Indigenous University in Whakatane. He has also contributed on a broad front to the New Zealand education sector as a whole, remaining as a leading voice in the challenge for the legitimate inclusion of Maori theorizing within the traditional academy. He has led a concentrated effort focused on producing increased number of Maori students at master's and doctoral levels, and his influence in that sense is felt throughout the educational context. He has built a broad-based international network of Indigenous scholars who work with Maori, and his theoretical leadership has informed the emergence of Maori education studies as a distinct entity within their education faculties within New Zealand universities. So for our global audience, here is an Indigenous leader who has informed the way in which we think about, conceptualize Indigenous education in the context of Aotearoa, New Zealand, but in a global context, offering much leadership and fodder for thought in terms of how to organize the university. Professor Smith has made significant contributions to the political, social, economic, and cultural advancement of Indigenous Maori communities within the context of Aotearoa, but also again to the thinking of Indigenous organizing in global contexts. It is with that that I invite you, Professor Smith, to come and deliver your talk. Welcome.
Kia ora tātou. Tuatahi kei te haere tonu ngā mihi ki te mana whenua o Rangitāne. Muri iho ngā kupu whakawhetai ki a koe meihana mō te kōrero whakamoimiti ki a tātou katoa i tēnei ahi. Huri no atu kia tātou katoa. So just thank you, Mohan, for those words of introduction. The longer you kept going, I normally don't put up too much of that, but I was hoping for an audience while you kept going. I do want to send my greetings to those who are online, and I do know that I've got friends in Canada who said they were going to drop in on this. So I just acknowledge Todd and his class in Victoria. All right, so and I guess also my colleagues from the university, just to acknowledge you all. And if I left out CARE, I'll just say that again, the members of CARE who've invited me here and who provide the support for this kōrero. Thank you very much. Okay, so I should begin by just telling a short story as a warm-up, and so this story is about Te Aute College old boys who were walking in the clouds in heaven, and they came across the pearly gates, and one of them said, "Oh, this is where all the good people go." So they rang the bell of the gate, and this person came to the doorway and said yes, and the group said, "Look, we're from Te Aute College, we'd like to come into heaven." And St. Peter said, "Well, it's not, you just can't enter, of your own volition. I have to check first." He said, "Just hang there a moment, I will go and check." So he goes inside his little room and he rings on the phone, ring, and someone picks up the phone at the other end and says, or she says, "God here." And St. Peter says, "Look, we've got this group of Te Aute old boys at the gate here, the pearly gates, and they want to want to come in, and God said, "Oh, I'm not too sure about that." And we let the St Stephen's old boys in. They were really good, and the St Joe's old girls were touch and go. But these Te old boys, I'm not too sure. I suppose we have to let them in. All right, okay, yep, let them in. So St Peter hangs up the phone, goes back to the gate. Anyway, next minute the phone is going off its hook. And God picks up the phone and says, yes, what? And it said, St Peter was there, and he said, they've gone. And God said, what, those Te boys have gone? And St Peter said, yes, and our pearly gates. Now, I don't really want to cast aspersions on TA old boys, but some of them are very good friends of mine. But just to say thank you to Meihana for his opening and being here as the DVC Māori, who is the lead person in a lot of the things that I'm going to speak to today. So the context really is we're aspiring to be a Tiriti-led institution, and that aspiration has with it a number of assumptions and hopes and desires on the part of the staff and our communities of interest. Immediately we say a treaty-led institution, it invokes two partners, and each of those partners, might I say, have different aspirations and different shapes to how they perceive and understand a treaty-led institutional environment. But many of our staff and colleagues are working very positively in taking up this challenge, and I want to acknowledge that. But the discussion that I want to bring forward today is actually a number of challenges that I think immediately accrue around the notion of the Māori treaty partner. What is it that we need to do? How do we reshape ourselves? What are the challenges and expectations that are placed over the top of us as we try and make the most of this opportunity? All right, so I'm speaking to this particular topic around transforming Indigenous education. That title is ambiguous, and it's deliberately so. I mean both elements of it, actually. I mean that we need to transform the processes of the institutional environment, and we need to be transforming in terms of the outcomes of what we do in the institution. So there's this dual expectation. The other part of it is that I want to raise the issue of the need to have a balance between what I call being a scholar, an activist, and a transformer, and the differentiation between each of those weightings, if you like, or positionings will become clear as I go through this talk. But key element why we've got all of these different sort of shapes, if you like, to our purpose is because we need to understand clearly what is not working and what is going wrong in order for us to be able to respond appropriately to make the transforming difference and the changes that need to occur. So where we're at as an institution is that the status quo and the way in which we're doing everything at the moment is not working a heck of well. There's still a lot to be done. Most of us know this and own up to this and want to do something different. So And for Māori, there's a further expectation that's placed on us by the communities that we purport to serve outside of the institution, who continue to suffer from high and disproportionate levels of socio and economic marginalisation. And that situation hasn't changed for years. And I guess what I'm saying here, there's an expectation on the public spend in public institutions to start to make inroads to some of these areas of need in our community. So in this bifurcated sort of shaping of a treaty arrangement, if you like, of the treaty partner and the non-Māori treaty partner, the part that's still underdeveloped in terms of our community outreach is our Māori community. So there's some attention that needs to be drawn to that point. So we need to, I think, respond to what I call our outcomes production of our work, that we need to focus on what it is that actually changes as a result of the work that we do inside the Academy that impacts our communities. Knowing, of course, that Māori are not homogenous, that we're not all the same, that there's some who are quite happy with the way things are organised, but the overwhelming feeling is that a lot more can be done and, in terms of Māori interests. Right, so key thing for me is we need to find a better balance in our workload between our institutional outputs and our community outcomes. By that I mean that often we're structured by the calling and the expectations of our institutional environment, which asking us to perform research. How many dollars do you bring into the institution? In terms of our PBRF, numbers of publications and weird and strange and wonderful journals that are not read by any of our audiences, but they count in terms of your PBRF ranking and so on. So all of those kinds of things, which is the institutional return, if you like, that the institution gets a return in terms of its ability to raise funds from those indices. On the other hand, I would say that our community outcomes in terms of the impact that we make in terms of change is not as good, needs more work. Right, so this, in this front bit, there's a little bit of just positioning really about the context, but I'll get beyond this very soon if you bear with me. So there's a number of things that I think that effective Indigenous academic work needs to do, and I won't spend too long on this, just pick a couple of points out, but mediate some of the ambiguities in education. There are ambiguities about liberation and colonisation. People are still working out, is coming to the university a colonising experience, or is it a liberating experience? And it's got that duality to it, and we need to be clear about how we mediate that. I'm not saying that we get it right all the time, but we need to understand it and to engage with it. The tension between outputs and outcomes, theorising and practice. Often we get accused of being jacuzzi intellectuals, doing our theorising from Cheryl Smith's jacuzzi. There's a need to move beyond just descriptions of our pathologies, of our existence. That often we do a lot of analysis and we can name the problems and say the problems, but the next phase of, well, what do we actually do about it and how do we engage with that is often fraught with structural anomalies, and one of those structural anomalies, for example, is there's not a hell of a lot of research funding that's given for applied research. You know, a lot of it's given for the front end of it, for identifying the problems, but actually getting in and doing the changes is often very minimal attention given to it. So, and then the last thing is that we need to be more transforming in our intent and move beyond what I call the privatised academic approach, that construction, where it's all about me and my promotion, and you know, the privatised academic sort of is held to the belief in the meritocratic principle of education. That is, you go to school, you learn, you get good credentials, you go out, you'll get a good job, and then you'll buy a flash Mercedes-Benz like Jeremy, and you know, and it's all about me and my bank account and so on. And we lose sight, if you like, of that responsibility, that outreach to a broader community of interest. And that notion is, if you like, I'm putting the privatised academic up against the notion of the public good responsibility, which is diminished. So in these stories that I'm going to share with you, they're not all about me, although I appear in a lot of the photographs, and it's not because of my looks. But what I want to acknowledge here is that my work has been with a lot of other people, stand on a lot of people's shoulders. I'm just one of a group, but the point I'm making here is that there is a part of my work that I think is important, that is about getting the calluses on the hands, the ringaropa, doing the work, doing the mahi. And I think, you know, to be fair, in our institution, one of the areas that I think we've made great progress in is some of the structural change around promotions, that again, recognising different forms of contribution, including the ringaropa contribution. So I just want to acknowledge that from our institution, that we're working towards some good things. So I want to begin with positionality, and just locate myself in this trilogy of callings, if you like, of activist, scholar and transformer. I wasn't always would class myself as an activist. When I went to University of Auckland, I was just lucky that all my colleagues, there were about 30 of us at University of Auckland at the time, were all in the Māori Club. Colleagues at that time were Sid Jackson, Tamaiti, the who's who of the what I call the transforming world at the time. I came from a private boarding school, and as I alluded to in my early story, we were very good boys. And so had to become conscientised, if you like, by rubbing shoulders with my colleagues at that time. So not everyone's born into this, that we come to our activism, conscientisation, if you like, the appropriate mindset by different pathways. Anyway, so at the time in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, I had a pretty long university career as a student. And, you know, there are a number of things that the civil rights movement, the women's movement, Black Power, anti-Vietnam protests, Ngā Tamatoa, Polynesian Black Panthers, the 1981 Springbok Tour. Some of those we were involved in, and some of them we were, our colleagues took the forefront, if you like. So these are colleagues of my time when I was there. In that top photo on the right, there's Tamaiti, Ringo Ohia, Paul Kotara, Orewa Barrett in the next row, Rawiri Paratene, who's Marama Davidson's dad, and a few other. I put Pedagogy of the Oppressed there because actually, that was a book when I read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a whole lot of things fell into place for me. It gave a language to all of the things that I'd felt in my upbringing and growing up, and the things that was very hard to explain. So simultaneously, at this time, I'm also doing academic work. I was doing a master's there. The only Māori students in doing masters at the time were Toda Eruwera, who was head of Ngā Tamatoa, and myself, working with Anne Salmon. But it called me to read critical theory, because critical theory, following the war, was attempted to try and explain why Mussolini and Hitler and so on were given so much support and so on. So there's a lot of critical work done to unpack a lot of those politics, if you like, and it was shaped as critical theory. So we had a good dosage of that. Post-colonial theory, again, same thing. A lot of readings around Fanon and the exiting of, or the independence movements of different countries around the world at that time, which created a critique of colonialism. And also for me, the new sociology of education, which looked at education as a process and began to critique the structures of education. Prior to this time, most of the explanations for educational underachievement or underdevelopment was there's something wrong with the learner, something wrong with those Māoris, they can't speak England properly, or there's, they've too many kids in the home, too many relatives living in the same household, poorer jobs, poorer income, and it was sort of focused this cumulative cycle of deprivation that entrapped Māori, which impacted in schools and learning opportunity. And but the new sociology of education, because we did a lot of interventions which were around deficit theory, and nothing was moving. And then the sociology of education said, we need to ask some questions of the structures of, okay, what about, is there something wrong with the curriculum? Is there something wrong with the way that we teach? Is there something wrong with the broader structures of knowledge in education? And these questions began to unlock some important elements, and also got some movement in the learning domain. So it's in this analysis, if you like, that I'm starting to do my PhD work. And so my PhD work, which was on Kaupapa Māori, was to bring all of this stuff together and to ask the question, is there a way in which we ourselves can begin to answer some of these questions? And I'll come back to that and explain the Kaupapa Māori stuff in a moment. But just in summarising this first piece, when I look back, I think there's 4 key learning journeys that I undertook as an emerging scholar at that time. One was about personal, political and critical conscientisation, coming to know for myself, that's the Pūrehuroa stuff, and the language and being able to understand that. And then the next important piece was really working out how my personal conscientisation might be enjoined with other people's consciousness to create, if you like, a more public or collective movement for change. Now, That comes out of the mouth pretty easily, but actually it's a really significant element. How do we mobilise collective action to make change that's meaningful? And so having to learn how to do that and to begin to participate in movements, if you like, that we're doing that kind of thing. So this, to cut to the quick here, the change really is a shift from conscientisation to transforming outcomes. How your mindset actually links to making the change that's required. The last bit, mind to heart, and you'll notice in all of these the arrows go both ways, so it's not just a sort of a instrumental sort of movement, but that from mind to heart is something I learned from my 8 years in Canada, working with First Nations in Canada, because they kept talking about this. The longest journey is from the heart to the mind, and I was trying to figure that out, what that meant, but I eventually got it. And it really relates to that there's a spiritual and emotional dimension to our work that's important, that we need to get beyond, if you like, a technocratic approach to transforming work. So my theory work is informed by practice. I do not speak about things that I haven't done myself. In this sense, the validity of my academic work is not just the writing outputs, or the voicing of my ideas. My academic credibility is to be also seen in the blisters on my hands. Moreover, I want to position myself within my work. I do not pretend to write in the third person. I am implicated in my work and own my claims and assertions. I freely admit that I am not always academically objective. And in this sense, I'm exporting, if you like, the responsibility for objectivity and neutrality, not from what I say, but onto the reader. You make the judgment about my work. I often ask my students in the front of their PhD theses to take this as part of their methodology. All right, so here's some quotes. I'm getting there to the stories, but here's some quotes I think that sum up some of the complexities of the business that we're in, and in particular what we will probably confront when we're dealing with our Tiriti-led aspiration. So the first one is a student of mine in Canada, PhD student. The second one was I think it was his master's that he was doing at the time, Taina Pohatu, here, and the third one was a colleague in Canada. Our people are still suffering. They are ill. Education is our illness and our medicine. All right, so as part of this presentation, I'm also going to demonstrate, if you like, a Kaupapa Māori approach, and I've drawn down on Jenny Lee Morgan's work on Pūrehuroa, which is basically telling stories, and out of the stories there's some learning that needs to be taken aboard as instructional, and we often need to tease that out and find those instructions. That methodology is linked to Joanne Archibald. So Joanne Archibald worked in my department when I was in Canada, and then Jenny Lee was also a student of ours at the University of Auckland. So I'm sort of linked to both of these scholars. Right, so I'm going to start with just the story A, which was the Kaupapa Māori Revolution. Began with Kohanga Reo, quite a bit of mythology around the beginning of Kohanga Reo, and one day we'll unlock that more, but for the moment It was the movement that began with the conference of Kaumatu and so on, and got tremendous momentum, sprung up all over the country. That some pictures there from Ngātari, Kohanga in Auckland, one in Gisborne, and Awhirenga, Kohanga Reo at the Teachers College in Auckland. And then the kids turn 5, of course, and have to go to school, and at that time there was no schools that were prepared to take kids, and the 2 schools that were doing that were extensions of their kohanga, which was, as it was known then, John Waititi Kura and Ruamata in Rotorua. But they were just an extension of their kohanga. What the Kura Kaupapa Māori movement, which was led by Tuki Nepe and others in Auckland, a group of parents, was to try and change the system to create a schooling type called Kura Kaupapa Māori schools. And there's a subtle difference, if you like, from the 2 parent schools, 2 matua schools, the Waititi and Ruamata. They came on board a little bit later to the political movement to change schooling type. And so these are different aspects of the schools. In Auckland, quite a significant time of growing schools, growing teachers. And so part of my research in my PhD was to look at these schools and to ask parents, why have you made the decision to bail out of the public schooling system and take a risk to go into an alternative schooling? Why have you taken that, had the courage to do that? And that essentially was my research. While I was doing this, I also taught a school as part of that work. Teacher education, so while we're struggling to keep our teacher education group supported at Massey, in the early days, Heikoko and Whaia, Evelyn Tobin and others were doing the teacher training at Teachers College. And of course there's another one with the Williams whānau in Auckland as well. That photo on the parliamentary steps is changing the Act to include Kura Kaupapa Māori schools in the Act. Right, so through all of this, what I have to say is that the real revolution that occurred in this time was not the wonderful schools and the wonderful different exemplars that we saw. The real revolution that occurred for Māori was up here. It was a shift in what I call mindset, from waiting for things to happen to us to getting up and doing things for ourselves. And to me, that was the major change that occurred. So after looking and asking all these parents why they made their choices, I aggregated their answers into 6 points, and these are the answers that the parents really came to. They wanted more control over the schooling of their kids. They wanted to maintain their cultural nuance, the taonga tuku iho. Culturally preferred ways, they wanted to learn in ways that connected with their home lifestyle, with the values and the things that they were doing in their homes. They wanted that to be an extension of their schooling. One of the most important things is the mediation of the socio-economic impediment. And while at this time everyone was able to say there is these major impediments related to the socio-economics of the family was affecting learning, no one came up with a solution, because the solution is you've got to print some money. And it's just Rupina's relatives said good at that, but the answer from my point of view was actually when we looked at what the whānau, the extended whānau, were doing when they were applying their traditional values of whanaungatanga, there was a mediation, if you like, of the socio-economic impediments. Our ability for reciprocity, to share our meagre resources. When the kids couldn't go on a school trip because they had no money in the whānau, didn't matter. All the kids went on the trip. Funding was found elsewhere. Kids didn't bring kai, didn't matter. All the kai went in the middle. Everyone had a kai. All of these things in our traditional values of extended family had what I call a social intervention factor that needed to be mobilised. And that's still there today. I think that's a major element that we need to build our whanaungatanga for that reason. And so whānau ora, in my view, that's the point of, actually, if we look back, that's one of the things that needs to concentrate on, is how we build our traditional values, because inside those traditional values is a social capital that's available to us. Extended, the whānau whanaungatanga collective vision. All right, the last thing is that out of this research, I wanted to change the way we thought about transformation. So most people think about transformation as being an instrumental thing. You go, have a good idea, it annoys you so much, I want to do something about it, and then you make the change. Very instrumental, sort of A to B to C. Only problem with this is when you create a change movement in this way, you create hierarchies. And so, we were saying things like, God, is she on the kaupapa or what? Well, what about those bilingual schools? They're not as good as the immersion schools. And when you create hierarchies, you create the potential for divide and rule amongst ourselves. And so I wanted to change the model. And so I've got reasons in my research for doing this, but cut to the quick. I rearranged this into a circle, put the arrows going both ways, and what I wanted to say was that I can plot every Māori somewhere in this circle. So it's not about hierarchies. And by that I mean is that, some people are going backwards, some people are standing still, hopefully some people are on their third iteration, and so on. Now the reason why this is important is actually very important for today as we deal in our iwi groups with the notion of post-treaty settlement, divide and rule from competing interests and so on. How do we speak collectively about what it is that we're about, rather than end up in this antagonistic sort of divide and rule competition? And to me the answer is that when you hold a model of transforming, which is different, which says, yep, they might be out of it now, but hopefully they're going to catch it and catch an iteration at some point. But I want to talk collectively about us, all of us, about our iwi, not just about this whānau versus this whānau versus this whānau. And that's one of the important things I think that we need, is a language of inclusivity, of how we can do things. So that's important. Right, 5 tests of the veracity of the Kaupapa Māori approach. We don't really need to worry about that until we've done it. But my latest work really has been to say, the claim to doing Kaupapa Māori, that this is what I would measure against. All right, so now let me start the story. So I'm going to start off with one that connects very much with Massey. And so I want to talk about so Monty Suter's work, although it was some, oh gosh, it's Te Ao Pohatu when he was here, but he was on staff for a short while, and he was also a student doing a doctorate here. But what I want to talk about was the impact of his work. His impact has been fantastic. He did his thesis on aspects of war in the Ngāti Pro, early Ngāti Pro leaders. But then he wrote on the C Company history. Then that book was translated into Ngāti Pro dialect, so it's become a model of Ngāti Pro dialect. He then led pilgrimages back to overseas to visit the graves of those soldiers who had fallen overseas. And as part of that, on one of our pilgrimages, we took a whole lot of senior pupils from the East Tairāwhiti schools, and the reason was that we wanted them to maintain, if you like, the memory of those soldiers who had fallen overseas. And that we visited Tunisia. Along the way, when we were on this particular trip, there's an important learning point here. We went to a place called 42nd Street, which was a group of trees, and it was here that there was a famous Australian and New Zealand bayonet charge through the trees, and it's called the Battle of 42nd Street. Our bus pulled up, we hopped off the bus, and one of our people said, "Hey, there's something in the bush, it's moving." And so we sent someone in to have a look, and in the bush was an Aboriginal family from Australia who were smoking the bush, whose ancestor, Reg Saunders, had served there in that bayonet charge with the Australian contingent. So, and we had arrived to do exactly the same, to undertake karakia and to do stuff as well. And so the point to me is that, you know, it's pretty clear. Indigenous people still want to be Indigenous. We still need to be Indigenous, and we're still practicing many of our important rituals and so on. Anyway, we joined forces, and there's a photograph there with the Opodi family and the Saunders family. Now, the Opodi family was the famous guy who jumped up on the ramparts with the Bren gun magazine cartridge and led the haka. And the Australians all jumped up alongside them, and in the storyline goes, they just were saying anything that came into their head, but it looked good and fearsome, and then they did their charge through the... again, that was just a learning point along the way. But part of that, you know, the war, we know about the leadership thing, but here's another story that came out of that, which is really, again, another learning point. So many of you may not know that the Māori Battalion actually defended Mount Olympus. Now, there's a huge irony here, of course, is that Mount Olympus is the home of the Greek gods. And so, you know, in a sense, the irony for me is here we are still trying to make space for our Indigenous language, knowledge and culture in our institutions, and yet our soldiers gave their lives defending, if you like, one of the bastions of Western knowledge on Mount Olympus. So the point wasn't lost on me, or actually, and Toi Ihorei, those the soldiers that were left behind in this last gallant action that occurred there. Well, the rest of the Māori Battalion pulled out. These 12 soldiers were left behind to hold the German line. And those soldiers were from around here, from Halcombe, from Hawera, from Whangaehu, and that's my Uncle Toi Ihorei. He was one of those soldiers. Quite a few of them didn't come back. He was captured and spent time But we saw where that trench line was in the trees, went to visit it. So 4 of us decided we're not going to miss this point, so we hired a helicopter from, we had to go in the town into Katarini to hire a helicopter, and cost us a bit, but we got a helicopter and we flew over the top of Mount Olympus. And I wasn't looking for Aphrodite, as someone said there. But it was just sort of that sense, if you like, of bringing things to sort of a, you know, for me anyway, that sense of irony, unlocking it. As part of Monty's work, we started a museum in Gisborne, which is, you know, and a whole lot of ceremony attached to that, but a collecting place. As part of that, part of his work, two thesis students that I've had that came through Awanuiarangi, both wrote on aspects of war history. The Harawira Peerless, who Hato Paura, old boy, another good school, who he wrote on Māori memory, and his critique was that the war histories, typical war histories, were very technocratic in the way in which they told the story, and he wanted to put people in the centre of the story, and their whānau and their histories. So, and his thesis, he did a very good piece of work, but out of his work he's got 5 projects, including now doing a book on war, it's not heroes, but people who were awarded medals and so on in the Māori Battalion. So he's doing that at the moment. He developed a kāpehu, a compass, which now can locate, you just need to land in the country, fill in the name, and you will get the coordinates to where that person is buried. And he's done that for all of the Māori Battalion soldiers. He's designed a battle honours flag, because Māori Battalion were one of the only battalions who didn't have a battle honours flag at the end of the war. And so on. So he's well into it. The other one there is Reuben Collier, who's a television film person who does, he's been doing docos and also running pilgrimages overseas. All right. So here's another story. So just a quick one. So this one's about Hideni meat, and it's around the Te Māori art exhibition. And you know, one of the things that's important about Massey is the calibre of the Māori art program that's here. It has developed over the years and is the leading entity in the country, and has attracted many students. But Hideni Mead developed this with the Mobile Foundation, the opportunity to take an exhibition of Māori art to the New York Met and beyond. Now, at one stage I gave them a hand to go and visit some of the materials as we were collecting, and so this is Te Kauru o Te Rangi, and where we found that was in the bottom of the Napier Museum, and it was in the basement, was covered over by sacking, it was just shoved in the corner, and there were 3 po. And he asked them to pull it out, they had a look at it, gave the nod, and yes, it became part of the exhibition. And it went away overseas, along with several of the other pieces. Along the way, actually, when the exhibition came back, I was also part of the education team involved with that. But this whole process involved training of docents, or the people looking after the art pieces in the museum. The iwi were involved, and so on. But the key thing is that these pieces went away. They were exhibited in the New York Met and in a couple of other museums. It became the second highest grossing exhibition after Tutankhamun, and held that position for a long time until the Monet exhibition surpassed it. There were people lined up for miles around the New York Met trying to get in to see that. And so what wasn't lost on me is the fact that once were artefacts in the museum, travelled overseas and virtually overnight magically turned from artefacts to objects of art, imbued with all of this monetary sort of equation, to the point that when it came time to send these taonga back, the insurance companies wouldn't allow all of them to travel on the same plane, because they had accrued so much value that if the plane crashed, the companies wouldn't be able to afford it. So, what we're talking about here, and as an educationalist, is the arbitrariness of knowledge. That in one context it's this, and in another context it's this. And it speaks to the idea that knowledge is socially constructed. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind as a learning point. And again, another old boy from Massey, who was part of this, but has continued on his work about the repatriation, digital repatriation of taonga, and has been working with a group at Cambridge University in London. How's our time? All right, so the next one I want to talk about is the higher education revolution. Talk about the development of the wānangas. And the reason I want to talk about this in terms of our treaty-led context is that the wānangas developed as a manifest critique of what Māori weren't getting, feeling they were getting out of higher education, out of the universities and so on. So we had these developments, 3 wānanga that developed. And I think it's useful for us as we're trying to reconfigure what it is that we might reshape ourselves as in terms of a treaty-led response, what the wānangas actually have done and where they've gone to. All right, so again, Hirini is involved there. Current CEO is Professor Doherty, Pūrehuroa Doherty. All right, so Awanuiarangi was one of 3. It was the last one that came on board. There's a couple of other ironies here associated with this. So the irony here is that in the 1860s, the government invaded Ngāti Awa and the Whakatohea iwi, and in the end the government confiscated lands from along the coastline there. Now the irony is that a little bit later on is that these lands, along with 10,000 acres from Tainui at Raglan and 3,000 acres from Ngāti Whātua at Kaupara, were given as an endowment for the University of New Zealand at Auckland. So what's the irony of that? The irony of that is that here we have a wānanga that's on the bones of its backside trying to make its way, and you have a huge institutional organisation who incidentally was recently almost gifted for was something like $20, it might have been a little bit more, the Epsom Teachers College campus, which is a huge multi-million-dollar land endowment. And yet the wānangas have struggled to be able to fund themselves, often having to fund themselves by treaty settlements and by making cases. So on the, you can see Auckland painted over the top of that map there. The wānanga is right in the centre of this health crisis that's abroad. It's one of the worst health Māori health scenes in the country. We're vying for Northland, keeps saying they're the worst, and Eastern Bay of Plenty keeps saying they're the worst. So Ihorei decided to establish a tribal university to help the community, help the iwi to think their way through this and to take more control of the education. So I went to the first hui with them at, it was held at Hokowhitu, and actually a lot of the people who became advocates, actually more than that, zealots for the wānanga, in the first instance didn't want a bar of it, but over time actually came on board. But a lot of this was actually do it yourself, build it from the ground up, scrounge the resources from where they're required, take a treaty settlement, which we did, and also the reason I'm involved here is because I was the foundation chair of the wānanga for the first 5 years of its life, which I took it up until we took the claim and won the claim. So there's the claim. So important thing here, and again the learning point, is the wānanga is not a set of buildings. It's actually a set of communities of learning, a set of ideas for learning. And I think it's something that we need to think about, you know, as we're playing around with treaty lead. I'm showing these and taking a bit of time about them because often people don't realise what the impact of the wānanga is. There's a study by Marriott and Sims recently out of the Economic Centre, an economic centre at Victoria University, which looked at 21 indicators of the socio-economic development of Māori. And Māori, the gap is widening in 20 of those areas except one. And the one where it's not widening is participation in higher education. And that goes down, I think, to the wānanga's contribution in terms of students. So we're just one. You've got Raukawa, you've got Aotearoa, each of them have got their own nuance. Awanuiarangi set itself on being a graduate sort of focus and degree granting institution. Critical studies is an important part of the work there. So Whakatane has come on board as a town. We have our annual parade down the main street. There's lots of people, non-Māori, acknowledging the students. Oops, there's Toi. Let's not blame Massey for everything. Yeah. All right, I don't need to say much about that other than, again, the Kaupapa Māori philosophy is Māori at the centre, and then working outwards from that. 5 minutes, how are we going? All right, so I think this is the last one. I took out Micronesia, but this is doing a lot of work in Alaska, because Alaska leans a lot on New Zealand's experience and the things that we've been doing in the teaching arena and our language nests and so on. So spend a lot of time there with the system-wide system. They've got 3 universities, so working out of the main office in Fairbanks with the 3 universities gave me an opportunity to get far and wide across, right up to the North Pole almost. So it's interesting watching rugby with a blizzard 40 below outside and tapped in on your computer watching rugby back in New Zealand. That woman there, Jana, she developed the whole Kaupapa Inupiaq curriculum on the North Slope, and sort of follows very similar to our Kaupapa Māori schools and so on. And the others are various parts of theorising. This is a small village right in the middle of all the mountains, playing fluid like this, and went and then and we were attending a ceremony for the handing back of the mountain, or the naming rights of the mountain being given not back to the Indigenous people, but the Indigenous people giving it to a Norwegian explorer who'd spent time with them many years ago. And that photo with those 2 women at the top there, that's them when they were sort of like 12 or 14. They were now 70 or so, and the same 2 women being photographed underneath it. So that's when he was there. So the Norwegian government were there to receive that. But again, part of this is sort of showing our influence and the potential for our international outreach as a Māori group inside an institutional framing. So we've got potential here in our to do work that's more international. This is a kura in Kotzebue. I shouldn't really say, but Kotzebue is a more, has a military underpinning to it. So it's got a lot of resources. Now, one of the other learning things is that one of the great struggles a person that I showed there, fought for years to get back traditional whaling as part of their lifestyle. And even though Mehana and I have got this over the top of us, when I was there, they had their best week ever in terms of catching whales. I was so annoyed. But it's a whole whānau activity. The whaling process has to be conducted in a particular way, and it's monitored by these, the science department in these big boats. So the first thing has to be thrown by hand, so people still chase whales in their, low-key boats. You know, a good week is 3 or 4 people in hospital and a whale landed, and then when they get back to the shore, if you notice that photo where they're pulling the whale, they have to break the shoreline by the traditional method, by pulling the whale ashore. Once it's ashore, they can hook it up to a tractor and tow it. But they have to, so what that does, it means is that their chants and their songs are still there, because they still remember their songs for doing that. And just threw in that picture of the whale meat there, because often a lot of people they think it's all blubber, the whale, but actually there's a lot of meat that's just like steak, and it's diced up and it's cooked in these big pots, and then it's packed away in the permafrost for winter. But it's just it's a lovely sustaining meal and feeds a community. So their communities, they're only allowed to take, I think it's 20 whales a year, and that's it. So, but it feeds their community. People are dropping off meat and so on to the old people's homes and so on. Again, a lot of these kaumātuas are involved in teaching. One of the great contributions from Alaska is their cultural standards work done by that gentleman there, Dr. Barnhart. All right, so I'm going to just conclude here now, and so the point of what I'm saying is that as we move towards our treaty-led opportunity, that, and I like the sort of the analogy here. It's one thing to have a beautiful house, but it's what we do inside it that is really important. So we've got work to do, and I think that if people have got the spirit of that, what I've been talking about, the activist, the scholar and the transformer, that we can shape something really new and unique for New Zealand. We have an opportunity, I think, to do that. And I think it's important to get behind our DVC, who's taking the lead on this, and to, help Meihana be successful, because it's a hell of a job, actually, that he's doing in terms of multiple meetings, virtually from noon till dusk, and he doesn't have time to shout his mates. Right, so again, my final comment, so colonisation hasn't gone away, just changed shape, and often those shapes are neoliberal in the way in which that's being formulated. That is, there's an intersection between cultural oppression and economic exploitation, and so we need to just understand that as we work our way through this. But, four elements that I think that we can do immediately, which is, I think, create the academic connectedness with our community struggles, those that are struggling, because it is conscientising, and that's the point I think I was raising about rubbing shoulders with Sid Jackson and Ngā Tamato and Tamaiti, all of those early activists, is that we learnt a lot. It was, again, I think those opportunities, so, and I've put there Te Ata Kura, because a lot of people probably don't know about that youth movement that Ronnie is involved with, which is working with a lot of young Māori leaders. And again, part of that is a conscientisation movement. Uhu Mātau, and that struggle there, that is a conscientising movement about, the living treaty today. The COVID responses from our iwi are all, again, formative sites for transformation. So the other thing is, I think that we need to be more deliberate and intentional about teaching critical studies and particularly in Māori studies. We've talked about that as a possibility moving forward, but I think across the whole of our institution, different disciplines that can take a different slant around that. But again, it's not the be-all and end-all, but I think it certainly connects with where the treaty partnership idea. And we need to be able to produce students who are useful to our iwi and can work in, particularly in this emerging climate of post-treaty sort of, I don't really want to say settlement. It doesn't come out of my mouth very easily because I don't believe that it's full and final for a lot of our iwi who are still developed and responded to. So, but in that context, and for us all inside our institution, we need to work hard, very much like has happened with in our responsiveness to promotion, build structural and policy accommodations that are positive and proactive in developing new alignments for Māori outcomes. And my final word is, we won't have a sustainable revolution of our social, cultural and economic conditions without a prior or simultaneous education and learning revolution. Kia ora.
Tuatahi rā kei te mihi atu ki a koe i Ngangaroa i te nui o ngā whakaaro rangatira kua horahia. Me kia ke rā i mua i a mātou e honoa tawhiti ana i tēnei rā. Just a few comments from me, and I'm not sure if there is a question in this i Ngangaroa, but firstly to acknowledge the significance but also the criticality of what's been shared with us today. I think it's a seminal précis of our history, our contemporary realities as Māori, but also a roadmap for our future. And I think that's what's really important about the presentation. It's so moving to see our tupuna back up on the screen and to see all of the things that they achieved and did in their time, but also the legacy that's been passed on. And I think very much about the work that you've done as an architect of Kaupapa Māori, both as a movement, but also as a way of living and a philosophy. And that's probably my question to you today, in terms of education and looking ahead, and in reflecting on what I think is probably the imposition of a Victorian age education system that's rooted in the industrial era, acknowledging the role that Kaupapa Māori has played in transcending that. What do you think the future looks like for these ones who are now coming into an age where Kaupapa Māori is normalised as part of both a system and a way of living. What do you think the future holds for these mokopuna and tamariki, some of whom are here today? Kia ora.
Kia ora. Well, first of all, can I say that the profound change that has occurred is that it is now possible, if you did a bit of dancing, to do an education totally in te reo Māori all the way through to a PhD, and which is something very new. So I think, for my part, again, picking up on the point that Māori are not homogenous in terms of what they might desire and where they're at, is that what we want to have is some excellent options in different pathways. And, you know, if, not my idea, but the neoliberal said, let the market decide. If that's the case, then you know, we have lots of people who actually are still unsatisfied with the options that they have in front of them and would like more of a, if you like, a Māori option that reflects their interests, their lifestyles, their backgrounds, and where their iwi are at the moment. So, but again, you know, I think that when I go overseas and look back at New Zealand, we're doing, you know, compared to other countries, a pretty reasonable job. I don't want to say that too loud because people take it and think they've done it. But actually we're doing a pretty good job in terms of the options that we have available, and people are often envious about what we're doing. But we've still got a long way to go, and that's my point, is that here we have an institution that's prepared to change. It's put wearing its heart on its sleeve, if you like, in terms of the treaty-led ambition. I think, you know, we're not going to get everything straight away, and it's not going to be, but I think it's a great utopian vision to build towards, if I can put it that way. And I think that's important.
Any other questions? Okay. I'm going to ask you a question then, Grant. You talk about transforming the neoliberal impulse that has colonized universities in the contemporary context. So what are some specific things we can do in terms of challenging the privatization of the academic that we talk about?
So, you know, I think immediately that we need to somehow reform the idea that the individual is paramount. It's all about individual freedoms and individual rights, because Māori, whether we like it or not, belong to whānau, belong to hapu, iwi. They're collective entities, so we have, if you like, collective responsibilities. We're not a, if you like, an entity unto ourselves. So I think we need to find ways in which we can challenge that, you know, so that again starts to speak to the structural accommodation, the policy accommodations around what counts as academic work, you know, and to broaden our definitions of that, to include some of our collective expectations and behaviours, to understand how, you know, I haven't talked about power. I deliberately kept away from some of the hard-line critical elements, but, you know, unequal power relations, the co-option of the notion of equality, and as being, you know, it's all about equality, that is the level playing field. And whereas, you know, we're more concerned for equity, that is, there is a need to get beyond just seeing everybody the same, that our aspiration is to be the same as everyone else. When we're starting a long way back, we need extra, if you like. Some people need extra, not everyone, but some people need extra to, if you like, create an opportunity. So, you know, that whole idea of equity needs to be interrogated because it's used as a great gatekeeping device. So the gatekeeping part of it is we must treat every New Zealander exactly the same. And of course, if the ship's already tilted and we're treating both sides the same, the ship remains tilted. And so what I'm saying is that in some cases we need to create, if you like, a compensatory form of equity for some parts of our community that need to be given a fairer opportunity and chance. So at the moment, you know, we're not interrogating these sort of ideas again. That sort of, but you know, that's one of the great, if you like, gatekeeping devices of the neoliberal project.
Thank you so much, Professor Smith, for sharing your wisdom with us. I would like to invite you, Professor Durie, to say a words of closure.
Right.
Ka tiake, I uera I te whakakapunga ka nō rā ngā mihi ki a koe i ngā roa. I te rangatiro ngā kōrero me ngā whakaro. Me ki pēnei au e whare wana no mō tātou katoa i tēnei rā. Nō reira, kia tau mai ngā manaakitanga ki ringa ki tēnā o tātou. Ke mahi ake te hua mā kihikihi, ke toi te reo, ke toi te mana Māori motuhake o rangi nui e tūnei ko papa tuanuku e hora nei, turu ofuti whakamaua kia tēnā, haumi e, hui e,
Tai ki e.
Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora.